Okay, we're back and we're continuing in our breakdown of the book of Revelation. We are currently in the second section of our outline, the things which are, which we call the church age. So let's give a quick review of what we've learned so far. So in our study of chapter 1, we stated that Jesus gives us an outline or a timeline, if you will, for this book, the book of Revelation. And that outline or timeline is given in verse 19 of chapter 1. And it reads, this is Jesus speaking to the Apostle John. Write the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which will take place after this. Essentially 3 sections in our outline. The things which you have seen, which is essentially John's vision of Jesus in chapter 1. Then he talks about the things which are, which is the church age or the 7 letters to the 7 churches. And we find that in chapters 2 and 3. And then the things which will take place after this, which is basically the future after the church age. Or in other words, after the church is raptured out of the world. So we are currently looking at the 7 letters to the 7 churches, which is section 2 of our timeline. And Jesus has instructed John to write 7 letters to 7 actual churches that are in Asia Minor. And we talked about how all 7 letters follow the same general pattern, and each letter containing 8 facets or 8 topics, if you will. And those 8 we call the 8 C's because we've labeled them all with a word that starts with the letter C. And they are a concise description, a conviction, a commendation, a condemnation, a command, a consequence, a confirmation, and then, of course, a conclusion. So when we talk about the concise description, this is Jesus announcing himself in each letter as the author of the letter. And he does this by using a description of himself that is borrowed from the vision John has of him in chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. And his description of choice is also pertinent to each of the messages that he has for that particular church. So the conviction is a statement of observation. I know your works. This is literally the second sentence in every letter. And then he gives a condemnation or a commendation where he tells them this is what you're doing right. Then a condemnation, this is what you're doing wrong. Then he gives a command, here's what you need to do or stop doing to get right or to stay right. Then he gives a consequence, here's what will happen if you obey the command or if you don't obey the command. He gives a statement of confirmation, here's the promise for those who do obey. And then the conclusion, which is he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. In other words, listen to what I just told you. Or listen to what I'm saying. Now, I mentioned that each one of these 7 letters was not only intended as a message for the 7 actual churches that existed, that they were written to at the time, but also each church is used as a metaphor to describe a specific period of time within the church age. In other words, each church that John writes these letters to is also representative of how the church body as a whole was behaving or being treated during a particular era in history, during the church age, and given chronologically, in fact. And it's an extremely impressive image when we put all the pieces of this together. And lastly, with regard to the content of all these letters, it's very important to realize that all of these letters are edifying for all of these individual churches and all of the eras of the church age, and for all believers in all the churches in all the eras of the church age. So if you're a believer, these letters are for you, all of them. So what are these 7 churches? So the first letter was to the church in Ephesus, which we called the Loveless Church. And this church represents the first century church. The church age while the apostles were still alive and establishing the church between the years 33 and roughly 100 AD. 33 through 100. Then we get to the church of Smyrna, which we called the persecuted church. And this represents the post-apostolic period when the church was being heavily persecuted by both the Romans and the Jews. And this would have been the era between a roughly AD 100 and the early AD 300s. Then the church in Pergamos, which we called the compromising church, it represents the period in church history when there was a lot of compromise to truth and doctrine. And this would have been between like the mid 300s to the late 500s. Then we get to the church in Thyatira, which we called the corrupt church. And this represents a very long era, the longest actually in the church age, which we figured to be around 600 AD to around 1500 AD. And this was not a boastful period of time for the church at all. Then we get to the church in Sardis, which we've labeled the dead church. This represents an era in the church age when the church was basically dormant. It might as well have not even existed. But much like the church in Sardis itself, it was essentially dead. This period of time was essentially a dead period for the church. And this was roughly between the early 1500s to the mid 1700s. Then we get to the church in Philadelphia, which is what we'll be looking at today. And we call this the faithful church. And this represents an era in the church age that was a great era of revival for the church. The founding of our nation would have occurred right at the start of this era, and it would have went on till around the late 1800s. And then that brings us to the last church and the last church era, church age, last era in the church age, I should say. And this is the church in the city of Laodicea. And this we called the lukewarm church or the complacent church. And this represents the final era, as I said, of the church age. And in my opinion, it's obvious that this era epitomizes our society today. Pardon me. Sorry. And today, we're going to begin looking at the church in Philadelphia, the faithful church. So let's read this passage, starting in verse 7, of chapter 3. It says, "And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, These things says he who is holy, he who is true, he who has the keys of David, who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens. I know your works. See, I have set before you an open door, and no one can shut it. For you have a little strength. You have kept my word, and have not denied my name. Indeed, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan, who say they are Jews but are not, but lie, indeed, I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you. Because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial that shall come upon the whole world, to test those who dwell on the earth. Behold, I am coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown. He who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. And he shall go out no more. I will write on him the name of my God, the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God. And I will write on him my new name. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." Okay, so the concise description that Jesus has for this church. He says, "These things says he who is holy, he who is true, he who has the keys of David, who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens." So he who is holy. This is Jesus simply saying that he is deity. He is God. He says he who is true. Now this isn't true as in the opposite of false. It literally means authentic or real. So he's saying he's not a phony. He's the real deal. He says he who has the key of David, who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens. This is a symbolic way of saying he determines whether or not anyone will enter his presence, or anywhere else for that matter. He holds the key to it all because he is sovereign. If he allows someone access, no one can deny it. And if he denies access, nobody can override his decision. The way is through him and him alone. So in verse 8, he begins by making, as in all the letters, his statement of conviction, which always says, I know your works. Once again, nothing you can do is hidden from me. I see it all. And based upon what he has witnessed and is witnessing, he gives his commendation to this church. And for the church in Philadelphia, it's a rather lengthy commendation. And like the church in Smyrna, he gives no statement of condemnation to this particular church. But there's another unique aspect about this letter also. And that is that Jesus has multiple promises that we don't see in any of the other 6 letters. In all of his letters, Jesus includes a promise near the end of his message in the section we've labeled the confirmation section, to the overcomers, in which he tells them what awaits them, or what awaits those who obey his words. But to the church in Philadelphia, he gives 3 additional promises here in the commendation section, over and above the one specifically for the overcomers. And we'll point that out as we continue through this portion. So, in verse 8, see, I have set before you an open door, and no one can shut it, for you have a little strength, have kept my word, and have not denied my name. That's the first promise that I mentioned. He says, I have set before you an open door. He's saying here that he is going to give them opportunities, and no one will be able to stop that. No one can shut. He's going to allow them to have access to do great things, things that a church of their small size would in no way have been able to accomplish without his sovereign help. And he says, for you have a little strength. And this is better translated if we remove the word a from in front of the word little and just say, for you have little strength. He's acknowledging that they are a very small church with very limited earthly resources. And even so, he is going to use them mightily. And why is he going to bless this particular church in this way? Well, read the next part of this sentence. He tells them it's because they have kept my word and have not denied my name. They were faithful. Remember from our last study what Jesus said to his disciples in Matthew 10, verse 32, that he will bless those who confess him openly. Well, this is what Jesus was doing to this church here in Philadelphia. He was blessing them for being faithful to his word and to his name. So verse 9 goes on to say, indeed, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews but are not, but lie. Indeed, I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you. And this is that second promise that I mentioned. I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you. So who is he saying this about? Those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not. Well, he's referring to super religious Jews in the surrounding areas who are really good at looking like they're living right. They follow all the rituals while folks are watching anyway, and they keep all the traditions religiously. They're very pious, but their hearts are dead and they're full of pride. They're worried about what people see rather than truly having any sort of relationship with God. So in his earthly ministry, who did Jesus tend to have the harshest words for most of the time? Almost all the time, actually. It was the religious leaders, the Pharisees and the priests. Listen to the words of Jesus in Matthew 23, verses 27 and 28. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so, also outwardly appear righteous to men. Even so, you also appear righteous to men outwardly, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." These are the types of people Jesus is referring to here. These folks surely think of themselves as being superior to the believers in poor, insignificant Philadelphia, right? After all, they're just a bunch of uneducated, dirty Hoosiers, right? I mean, well, all of us conservatives out there, does any of that sound familiar? Of course it does. Jesus warned us that this is how we would be looked at. And Jesus tells this church, "I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I loved you." Our Lord loves to exalt the meek and to humble the proud. And that's what he's saying here. I will make sure that they know that you are loved by me. And that's a powerful picture. Verse 10, he says, "Because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial, which shall come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth." This is that third and final additional promise that I mentioned. And it's a direct message that they will not have to endure the tribulation. I also want to point out that this is a great verse to add to our arsenal for us to use when folks try to argue that believers will go through the Great Tribulation, or for confirmation that to answer that question of will there be a rapture and will it happen before the tribulation. He's telling faithful believers here that they will not have to endure that wrath, and how he will assure that believers won't endure this by removing them from it, by rapturing them. All right, so back to the church in Philadelphia. Why exactly is he giving additional promises to this church? Well, he says in verse 8, "You have kept my word, and you have not denied my name." And then in verse 10, he says, "You've kept my command to persevere." It's because they were faithful in keeping his word and professing their faith, knowing, studying, and teaching the word, which was the command to persevere. They were more than just hearers of the word, but doers also, just as we're commanded to be when we read James chapter 1, verse 22, which says, "Be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves." And here Jesus is giving this church an attaboy, if you will, for being this way. So his command to this church, what did this church need to do in order to remain in good standing? Verse 11 says, "Behold, I am coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown." Hold fast what you have. Well, what exactly did they have that Jesus was referring to? And the answer to that question is found when we read back in verse 8, where Jesus says the words, "You have a little strength." In other words, they consistently relied upon him for their source of strength. Once again, they were faithful. And because they were faithful, they kept his word and his name. And he's telling them here, keep it up. Hold fast to that way of thinking. Now, at the beginning of verse 11, where he says, "I am coming quickly," this isn't in reference to coming soon. This is a way of stating I am coming like lightning. I'm coming fast. In other words, when it happens, it'll be so fast that your mind will have to do a double take. It'll happen in the twinkling of an eye, as we're told. Remember in our previous study how he told the folks in the church in Sardis, I will come upon you as a thief, and you will not know the hour I will come upon you. This is sort of the same thing. It'll happen so fast that you won't have time to think about it. So he says for them to hold fast so that no one may take your crown. The crown here is referring to their eternal rewards. It's not necessarily speaking of a physical crown, although that is something that will happen also. But here he's referring to the position that each believer will hold in the millennial kingdom. As you remember, last time we spoke a little bit about this topic, that we will reign with him in the millennial kingdom. Well, these crowns are a metaphor for what specific duties we will have during this time period. That's our reward, positions of significance within the kingdom. So let's reference when in Luke 16, verses 10 through 11, Jesus said, he who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. And he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in what is much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to you trust of true riches? So the unrighteous mammon. Other translations say earthly riches. This is what Jesus was speaking, or this was Jesus speaking in the same manner, but with a negative spin on it. The Bible is very clear that in the afterlife, we are not going to be sitting on some cloud somewhere, plucking a 12-string harp and bored out of our minds. We're going to be working, we're going to be praising and worshiping. There will be no boring days. For 1,000 years, immediately after the Great Tribulation, Jesus will return to the earth, bodily, physically, and boldly, to set up his millennial kingdom. Millennial means 1,000 years. And the positions we hold in that kingdom is our reward. That is what the crown in verse 11 is representative of. And Jesus' command to this church is to hold fast, to keep on the track that they're on, so that they can claim that reward. So, as believers, this is where our works come into play. Now, we've talked a lot about this, that we are not judged by our works when it comes to matters of salvation. But that isn't what we're referring to here. This is our reward for being faithful stewards of what God has given us. In other words, you can be saved and receive no rewards. Would be a sad thing, but it is something that could possibly happen. Just as punishment in hell will not be the same for everyone who's there, the rewards for all believers in heaven will not be the same either. There are differing degrees of punishment and rewards in eternity future. So, the confirmation in verse 12, he who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go out no more. I will write on him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God. And I will write on him my new name. This is now his promise to the overcomers, over and above the 3 given to the church as a whole in verses 8 through 10. The words he who overcomes should be thought of as present tense. It's a message of promise to believers who are constantly overcoming any and all obstacles, hardships, temptations, whatever the case might be. Those who continually remain faithful. It's not a one-time act. It's a constant action. It's a lifestyle. So he says here in verse 12, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. So it's something that's important to note about the city of Philadelphia with regard to this particular promise. is that the city was surrounded by volcanoes and fault lines, and it was very prone to earthquakes because of this. And they were constantly having to rebuild this city. In fact, if you recall, when we looked at the church in the city of Sardis, we talked about how the city of Sardis was rocked by an earthquake in AD 17. That very same earthquake all but completely destroyed the city of Philadelphia also. But what would happen when they would have these earthquakes is the shocks would decimate nearly everything in the city. However, the things that would almost never be affected by these tremors were these massive pillars inside these temples. They were almost always still standing, though everything else was flattened completely. So, if you visit the city today, which is now called Alaşehir, Turkey, the main attraction from a tourist standpoint are the remnants of a place called St. John's Cathedral. And all that's left to see there really is these massive columns or pillars. So if you go back and you look at the thumbnail that I used to represent this particular video on my page, you'll notice a picture of these massive pillars. Well, that's exactly what that picture is. It's a picture of the pillars left over from St. John's Cathedral. These things are, massive things. This was, these pillars themselves are the size of, medium-sized houses. And these were just the pillars in this temple. So you can see how powerful this metaphor is that he's using here. He's essentially saying, I will make you untouchable. As individual believers, he will make them stable. And the Bible tells us as believers that we are the temple of God. But also corporately, as bodies of believers, he will make them or us immovable. And the Bible refers to individual believers as living stones. And we're told that Jesus is the chief cornerstone. This is all speaking of giving believers a spiritual endurance and perseverance in this life, but also, and more importantly, eternal stability. So when we continue in verse 12, it says, and he shall go out no more. So Philadelphia, as we mentioned, was very prone to these earthquakes and these tremors. And because of this, most of the folks lived on the outskirts of the city rather than within the city walls. What Jesus is implying here to these believers is that in the eternal city, they will no longer need to do that. They will be able to live within the city. So verse 12 then goes on to say, I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God. And I will write on him my new name. This is all a sign of possession. It's actually a very beautiful picture. It's a sign of possession. They will belong to God. They will belong to the city of Jerusalem, and they will belong to Jesus Christ. So, his conclusion, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. This is the same conclusion that he has in all of his letters. And he's saying here that if your ears work, then take heed to what you've just been told. Listen to what I've told you and take it to heart. Okay, so I've had a few recommendations from people that follow me asking me to shorten some of my messages a little bit. I know the last couple were pretty long, and I have to agree with them. It's probably a good idea to shorten them a little bit. For a lot of reasons. Attention span for one, but just, not everybody has all day to watch a video. So what we're going to do is stop with this one right here. I hope you enjoyed that lesson on the church in Philadelphia. The next time we pick up, we will be looking at the final letter to the lukewarm church in the city of Laodicea. I hope you enjoyed this message, and I hope you learned from it. And I hope you're looking forward to the next one. We'll see you next time. Thanks.